Hi everyone, welcome to Morning Matcha. I'm super excited to share with you today's guest. It's someone who I personally wanted to talk to for a little while now. Her name is Christy Harrison, and she's an anti-diet registered dietitian and author of a forthcoming book, Anti-Diet. Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. I kind of learned about you, I think, through my friend Katie Dalebow. And I don't know, have you guys done a podcast together or?
So many podcasts together.
Fun.
She was on the first season of my the second season of my podcast. We did like a podcast swap back in the day in 2014 when podcasts were brand new and we'd already been going strong for a year each of us. So. And then just many podcasts of each other's over the years.
Cool. Well, I remember her posting about your book and I was like, what? This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is what I'm going through. This is amazing. I want everyone to have access to this information. And I just immediately fell in love and so excited to be here in New York with you. So I just kind of want to learn more about you first. What brought you here? What's your background? Before getting into all the anti-diet stuff.
Yeah, so my background's very winding. I started my career as a journalist, and I'm actually from California, from the Bay Area, and I went to school out there, and after school I was looking for jobs as a journalist in California. There was really nothing in the Bay Area to be found. I filled in for someone on maternity leave, and then she came back, and I was like, okay then, I guess I'm gonna freelance.
Yeah.
And there are tons of journalism jobs out here. This is kind of where magazines are, and that's what I wanted to do, so I moved to New York. At the same time, I was struggling with my own disordered eating. It was sort of proto-wellness back then. It was 2003, 2004, so it wasn't the wellness culture that it is today, but I got into Michael Pollan, Marion Nestle, Eric Schlosser, all the sort of real food advocates, and started cutting things out of my diet. I also got really obsessed with gluten and became gluten-free and experimented with other food restrictions and eliminations and just went down the rabbit hole. And I got, no surprise, worse and worse symptoms that I now realize were due to the disordered eating, but that I attributed to, oh my God, I'm allergic to all these foods, I'm intolerant to all these foods, I need to cut out more.
Yeah.
So I think that's what the wellness, what I've come to call the wellness diet, that's what it really does to us, is it makes us think if we're still having problems and we're already doing some things that it's telling us to do, the problem is not the wellness diet, the problem is we need to cut out more food.
Yeah, it's not enough and you need to keep going.
Exactly. Yeah. So I kept going and going, and I ended up restricting and binging, losing my period, having I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which runs in my family, but maybe was triggered by that. I don't know if it would have come on at the age that it did otherwise. And I had all kinds of other drama around my health that just, unexplained health conditions that I blamed on food.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, I was I specialized in food and nutrition and health because that's what I was obsessed with. I made those things my beat, and I kind of had license to obsessively research them all day long. So I wrote several articles about gluten-free diets. I wrote about organic food and, the pesticides in foods and all the problems with agriculture, as it is, and just kind of became obsessed with all that research and, but got praised for it. Got bylines, got story assignments, got hired at magazines and all this stuff. So it was really reinforced. But also silently I was struggling, I was suffering, and nobody really recognized that. And in fact, I ended up working at Gourmet magazine, which I think was really a blessing because that was a foodie magazine, and I was surrounded by a lot of people who loved food and had a pretty positive relationship with food. And that started to break down some of my lingering food rules. I also had dated a guy who was a foodie, although he taught me that term was really uncool, but I still don't know a term to say to describe what that is. So, kind of a guy who's obsessed with food adventures and eating different kinds of food, and that had really helped me stop the restricting as much and over-exercising and all of that. But I was still secretly doing some of those things, and it wasn't until I worked at Gourmet that I started to really be forced to practice every day kind of allowance with food, and still was super disordered, still was very much caught up in the diet mindset, what I now know is the diet mentality or internalized diet culture beliefs. And so Gourmet ended up folding in 2009, and I sort of heard rumblings that was going to happen, and I decided to go back to school to become a nutritionist, a dietitian at that point, because I wanted something a little more stable in my life than journalism, and I also wanted to sort of unlock the code of how can I finally be healthy, how can I help end the so-called obesity epidemic that I really believed in at the time that I now know is really
deprivation.
Yeah, exactly. And also like weight stigma, basically calling it an obesity epidemic is weight stigmatizing, it's harmful, it's a moral panic, as some of my colleagues call it, not an actual public health crisis. But at the time I thought, that's what I was going to do, so I went and got my Master's of Public Health Nutrition, my dietitian's license, and then I started to work in the field, first in city agencies, basically, the City Department of Health. I did a lot of like community nutrition programs, and worked in hospitals and homeless shelters and things like that. And so kind of got a sense of the food environment from that perspective, but was really missing that sense of like culture, food culture, connection with food, people's relationships with food. And having had such a messed up relationship with food of my own, I knew that was something I was interested in writing about and covering, and so I started a podcast. In 2013, I started my podcast, Food Psych. I had actually been working on a book proposal about those topics in 2010 and sort of wasn't able to get it together, I think because I was still healing from the end of my own issues. But I started the research then. I started to research intuitive eating, kind of the early research on the anti-diet movement was there in my research for the book. And so then that ended up turning into the podcast. And so with the podcast, I started to do work in the disordered eating field. I got experienced in disordered eating and then developed expertise in intuitive eating, healing my own relationship with food along the way through intuitive eating. Actually, that's what when I discovered intuitive eating in 2010, that's what started to heal my own relationship with food. Because I'd been an intuitive eater before all the disorders started in college.
Yeah.
And so it was actually relatively easy for me to click back into that. And I had the privilege of being able to do that too, because I didn't have as much trauma of diet culture as I see from some people that I work with. I think largely due to thin privilege, white privilege, economic privilege, all these different privileges that I have that sort of protected me from being traumatized by diet culture as much as people in larger bodies often are, or people in other circumstances are.
Wow,
Yes.
so much information. Thank you. I mean, thank you for being so open about your own personal journey too. You mentioned in there that your own disordered eating kind of started in college.
Yeah.
When would you say, what would you say triggered that?
Yeah, so I went and studied abroad in Paris my junior year of college, and I changed birth control pills. I ended up just getting a bunch of free samples from my doctor of a different birth control pill that I had been on. She's like, here's a year's worth, go take it to France. And I started taking it, and it caused weight gain as a side effect, but also all sorts of other symptoms. And I now realized that it was interacting with a hormonal condition that I have, and so, had triggered that condition. But at the time I didn't know that. I was just like, what's happening to me? I'm splitting my pants. I also had acne and just other symptoms that were really coming on suddenly. And so instead of understanding that it was related to the pill or suspecting that, I did what most people who are raised in diet culture do when they can't button their pants anymore. I went on a diet. And in France, they say that French women are so blasé with food and just effortlessly thin. That's bullshit, honestly. That is, I don't know if I can swear here. Okay, but it's total bullshit. It was very diety. It was a total diet culture, and people would give me advice on what to do to lose weight and comment on my weight.
Random people?
I mean, people I knew, friends and stuff, but or friends of friends, sometimes not always solicited. But it was
terrible.
Yeah, it was really frustrating, and just I had never experienced anything like it. Talk about thin privilege, right? I had never gained weight. I had never known what that was like, and so I started trying to lose weight. I started restricting my food, even though I was terribly hungry, another side effect of that birth control pill. I started, cutting out different types of foods that I thought were bad, and
gosh, doing that in Paris, I can't imagine.
It was so sad. I was really missing out on a lot. And then I came home. That was my second semester of junior year that I kind of got serious about it, because I hadn't even realized what was going on until my clothes stopped fitting. And then I came home and sort of doubled down on all the food restrictions, and that's also when Atkins was in full boom. I think Paris hadn't quite gotten it yet, but I came home and was like, oh, everybody's doing this Atkins thing. I'm gonna just dive right in and go low carb, and was also trying to count calories at the same time, but which, I mean, Atkins basically is like a calorie restricted diet, but it's also a low carb diet. So I was doing that. I was sort of doing my own DIY version of that because I was also trying to be gluten-free at a certain point. Like, I started to develop all the symptoms of, you know, thyroid issues, period issues, etc. And a family friend who was into alternative medicine was like, oh, have you looked into gluten? You might have celiac disease. Maybe that's what's going on.
So then you're like, okay, that's what I have.
And I went and got tested, and the doctors were like, no, you don't have it. You don't have the gene for it, you know. But I was like reading all these message boards where people are like, it took me forever to get diagnosed, and it never showed up on, you know, it never showed up on panels from an allergist, but I did it anyway. I went gluten-free myself, and my symptoms got so much better. And so I was like, I'm doing that.
Yeah.
Without, you know, because at the time, I mean, in college, I majored in rhetoric and French literature. I did not major in nutrition. I didn't have any sort of scientific background, really. That came later when I went to grad school. So I was just like buying all of that stuff hook, line, and sinker without knowing how to read the research, without knowing how to understand the science or lack thereof behind these gluten-free diets. And so I just, you know, started down that rabbit hole, and then no one could really convince me otherwise. Even doctors, even, you know, smart friends that I talked to who reported on science, who knew science journalism. I actually had a friend say, you know, I think, what about like if you started eating more? What if, you know, do you think some of your issues might be related to like how restrictive you are with food? And I was like, oh, please.
You're like, that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
How can that possibly make sense? I have a very similar story, actually. I just like kept going and took my doctor to just say, who is like a functional medicine doctor into all this, who was like, go home and eat. Like, I just want you to go home and eat everything. I want you to just like forget everything you've learned, because it's, you know, it's so difficult. You're like brainwashing yourself, essentially, just like reading. And I don't know about you, but for me, I started feeling better before I started feeling worse, which I think is what made me keep going. So I'm curious if you had that experience.
I totally did.
Yeah.
And now I know it's something called the nocebo effect, which is like when you think something is hurting you, you will have symptoms from that thing. Like if you think gluten is harmful, you'll have symptoms when you eat gluten, and you'll feel better when you take it away. And so that's, I think, a lot of what causes people to think that, because there's all this information out there in the zeitgeist, and more as time goes on, I think, that makes people think they're allergic or intolerant to these foods. And so, yeah, they take it away and it's like, oh, relief.
Yeah.
And then actually the symptoms just come back as that sort of psychological, you know, that, I mean, it can be very powerful. The nocebo effect can last, but it can also go away in the face of like mounting other symptoms. And
Are you saying nocebo or placebo?
so nocebo, it's the opposite of the placebo, in the sense that like the placebo effect is you take something that doesn't have any effect, but you think it makes you feel better.
Yeah.
This is you take something that doesn't have any effect, but you think it makes you feel worse. Like gluten or dairy or whatever, you know, people are self-diagnosing with.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So now there's a term for it. That makes so much sense. Did you feel like your education, getting your going to grad school, that helped you? Or was it post-grad school when you started interviewing people and kind of getting into intuitive eating and stuff, that was when you really kind of, like, what did you learn in grad school?
I think grad school helped me to some extent to feel a little less fearful about particular types of foods, because for all its problems, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics curriculum really does have this all foods fit model and doesn't demonize particular foods. So that was helpful in terms of like letting go of the fears about gluten, about carbs. But there is some, and there was even at the time, some sort of fears about processed food creeping into the mix. And especially where I went at NYU is actually where Marion Nessel teaches. She's was the chair of the department, had founded the Department of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health. So that idea of like the food system and certain foods, you know, processed foods being the ones to demonize was kind of in the zeitgeist there. So it actually kind of made that part worse for me.
Okay.
You know, it wasn't like, it's like the all foods fit model of like, you can have carbs, you can have fats, you can have protein, you can have all the, you know, different types of foods you want. But then there's this other piece of like, be careful where your food comes from. So it was complicated. It was a double-edged sword. And I also, they teach you to like determine people's ideal body weight in school for nutrition, and which is like horrible, because I had to like weigh and measure myself and compare myself to ideal body weight charts, which are, I mean, our professor said like these are considered outdated. These are sort of just like a ballpark estimate, but they're usually on the low side. But mine was like, it happened to be the number that it spit out that was like my ideal weight was my lowest weight in my eating disorder. And so that's why I was like, I just panicked, at first. I was like, do I need to go back there? Do I need to do that stuff again? That's the only way I've been able to be at that low of a weight in my adult life. And then I, pondered it for a couple of days and realized like, that is ridiculous because, I had been learning up until that point that it's not healthy to be restrictive like that. It's, my school for nutrition also was really helpful in that regard of like, you need to have sort of a minimum amount of calories to function, minimum amount of carbs to function. And so I knew enough to know like, okay, what I was doing before wasn't healthy.
And probably emotionally, like if you're so stressed about it, right, then how can that be healthy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's not what I learned in school. That's what I learned later. But yeah, that's, a huge part of it too. So I just decided at that point I was going to drop the scale. I was going to, I deleted my calorie tracking apps. I gave away my scale. Now I would smash it, but, like gave it to Goodwill or something and just, stopped following any of that stuff. And I think that was really helpful. So I was challenged, I was triggered, sort of the eating disorder threatened to pull me back in, and then I said no and walked away. And shortly thereafter, I discovered the book Intuitive Eating because I was researching my book that never ended up going anywhere, the first book that I was researching, which sort of informed the book that I now have written. So it all sort of comes full circle. But.
Wow, I'm so happy you're doing this work. So then you started doing the podcast. Did you start your private practice at that time as well?
About the same time, yeah. So I, immediately, because I had already had this first career as a journalist and worked for other people for many years, but also had worked as a freelance journalist and had my own business that way. I was like, I am ready to be done working for other people. I was ready to go into private practice. And when I was doing my training as a dietitian, I luckily got to work with eating disorder treatment centers and also to counsel some people in a clinical setting, where they didn't have an eating disorder specialist on staff. And so I became kind of the go-to for people with eating disorders. And so that gave me the experience where I was like, I'm going to just open my private practice and specialize in eating disorders.
Would you say that eating disorders happen to a certain class of people?
I don't think there's really any class or ethnic or demographic differences in who actually gets them. I think there is definitely there are definitely major differences in who gets diagnosed. So the people that are stereotypically considered to be people who suffer from eating disorders are usually thin, pretty emaciated, white, economically privileged people, right? And usually female, usually young as well. So, but we know from the research that there are significant rates of eating disorders and disordered eating, which is like subclinical rates of disordered behaviors with food where, maybe you're not doing it X number of times per week to be diagnosed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but that doesn't mean there's not still a problem because any level of, disorder, dysfunction with food is still distressing to the person.
Yeah.
And we see that these rates of disordered eating and full-blown eating disorders really exist across ethnic groups, across ages, across genders. Trans people actually have the highest rates of eating disorders of any gender identity, and so even more so than cis women. And so really it's a problem across the board. It's just that it's only really seen and spotted in people who look one way, and that's really because of diet culture and weight stigma. It's because we think that the only person who can have a problem with
is if they're thin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I now know that there are people who are in larger bodies, much larger bodies, who are starving themselves.
Yeah.
And not emaciated by, sort of regular standards, but emaciated for them, for their body. And they're not getting the help they need. And actually, usually by the time those folks get into treatment, they're further gone, they're further down the road of a full-blown eating disorder and have a much harder time recovering. And that's all because of weight stigma, because weight stigma keeps them from getting the help they need in the first place.
I have so many questions for you. I kind of want to go back real quick though, when you were talking about at NYU and how the processed food, like just knowing where your food comes from, because I want to know like how that can become problematic.
Yeah.
Because I really care about where my food does come from, right? But that's one piece that I'm still like really passionate about, but I also want to learn about how it could be a bad thing.
Yeah, totally. I think it's knowing a little bit of that, I think can be fine, doesn't necessarily have to be part of a disorder, and can be part of someone's maybe political efforts to like help the environment, for example. But I think it can easily get down this rabbit hole, like, just as the other behaviors we were talking about, where any sort of calorie restriction or macronutrient restriction or restriction on the time that you're eating or the type of food that you're eating has the potential to really take over your life. Mm-hmm. And it's no different with, thinking about like, I only buy organic or sustainable. I mean, for me personally, like I spent hours in grocery stores when I was at my sickest, thinking like, reading labels and thinking, do I get the, local one that is not organic, but is, they use sustainable methods, or do I get the big, factory farmed organic thing, but that's, it's organic and has the label, and, the whole Michael Pollan thing of like eating local versus, trying to support organic agriculture, or trying to just like do my best in any situation where there wasn't always an easy sort of obvious option. So it can, I personally know and have lived experience of how it can be so debilitating to have that knowledge and to sort of obsess about that knowledge. And I've seen that in so many of my clients as well, people with orthorexia, which, that's the sort of clinical term for what it sounds like we had, and I know Katie had as well, and just shared about that publicly, where it's obsession with healthy eating, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the sort of Michael Pollan, Marion Nestle style of eating, right? This idea of like knowing where your food comes from, knowing your farmer, being attentive to sustainability has the real potential to trigger orthorexia in people. Mm-hmm. And the other piece of it that I think is so problematic is that it's really tied up with weight stigma. So a lot of the basis of that movement comes from this idea that fast food, processed food, factory produced food is responsible largely for the so-called obesity epidemic. And that really started around the early 2000s with Eric Schlosser and his book Fast Food Nation. Yeah. I think kind of was the genesis of that. Mm-hmm. And then, people like Marion Nestle, Michael Pollan picked up on that. Morgan Spurlock with his film Super Size Me, right? Mm-hmm. So like it was very much in the zeitgeist in the early 2000s, this idea of, oh my God, our food is killing us. Yeah. And it dovetailed nicely with a sort of emerging trend of calling so-called obesity an epidemic. Mm-hmm. That actually didn't start until the late 1990s. There was sort of this inflection point where that term was coined by a researcher at the CDC, along with these maps that he released. You've probably seen those color-coded maps of like obesity rates across the United States, right? And suddenly those maps were everywhere. They were in the hands of journalists and academics, and all these people who had, positions of influence were talking about them. And that made its way into popular literature, like Fast Food Nation, like Michael Pollan's work. And so really this idea that did not even exist prior to like the early 1990s, suddenly took over our consciousness. Also, the low carb craze, right? The Atkins thing that was happening, I think sort of made it worse. Yeah, it fit in nicely with that too, because we had just seen, the transition from low fat to low carb came with a lot of confusion, I think, for people, because it had always been low fat, right, for most of people's lifetimes, or, the time that they were paying attention from the 70s onward, really the 60s. Through the 90s or to the mid-90s was, low fat was the thing. And then suddenly all this supposed nutrition knowledge was upended by this new research or, really new people talking about low carbohydrate diets, not necessarily a lot of scientific research, but then the scientific research followed, saying that, low carb was better. And so I think a lot of people had a lot of confusion about nutrition, knowledge, nutrition as a science. Like, do I even listen to people, nutritionists? Like, who's to say what's healthy? Mm-hmm. And so I think the Michael Pollans of the world came in at that time and really gave people this wholesale alternative, which was like, you don't have to pay attention to what these government agencies are telling you is the right macronutrient to eat or avoid. You can actually just think about where your food comes from and think about, whole foods and plant-based foods as kind of the basis of your diet, rather than thinking about macronutrients. So it really, I don't think it ever would have been possible for that moment to happen and to get us to this like moment in wellness culture that we have now, if it weren't for all those roots kind of being in place already. Yeah, that makes sense. Everyone just kind of got so confused, and then we ended up going the route of, I would say all of us kind of Michael Pollan, but then keep learning, and then
now all of a sudden everyone's keto, which is like the same as Atkins, which is just ridiculous.
Which goes back to the 1860s,
Yeah.
by the way. Like the first low-carb diet on record, or that, you know, was a popular low-carb diet, was in 1865 by this guy named William Banting. And it was like, it's the same shit under a different name, you know, different packaging.
And new like added or new like sugar substitutes.
Exactly.
So crazy. So as far as orthorexia goes, since we're talking about, I had it definitely, and we all have an experience with it. But I would say, listening to your story and knowing Katie's, that we've all also had an experience with having an eating disorder prior to this. Mm-hmm. So is that someone who's more susceptible to having orthorexia? Because, like, to give you a little bit of an idea, I'm putting on a conference called Unwell. I think you've heard about it. We really wanted you on, but you're so busy. Yes. And the whole idea around it is thinking about why are we so obsessed with perfection as a society, and how is it that with this like boom in the wellness industry, why are we taking it to the extreme? Mm-hmm. So because like we all want to be well, but really it all goes back to like being thin and like always being our best version, which is great until you take it way too far. Mm-hmm. But some of the panelists that I've spoken to that are really excited about it, I would say like 75% of them that have had this experience have also had eating disorders. Yeah. So I think it's great that we're sharing this information, and I'm sure there are a lot of people that have eating disorders that are now doing things in the name of wellness. So it's important, but I'm just curious, do you think that orthorexia is something that someone who didn't previously have an eating disorder, like they could also be susceptible to it?
Totally. I mean, I think orthorexia is an eating disorder unto itself, mm-hmm. but orthorexia is also kind of a style of behavior. You know, mm-hmm. you can have orthorexic behaviors without having, and it's not even a clinical diagnosis yet, it's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual yet, mm-hmm. so it's sort of based on like the best available scientific criteria for diagnosing orthorexia, but actually there's some talk in the scientific community about whether it better fits under an existing eating disorder diagnosis or whether it needs to have its own diagnosis. But you know, to me really the point is like, I was never actually diagnosed with an eating disorder. I just now can look back with the knowledge I have and say, oh, I was diagnosable at this point in time, mm-hmm. right? But I think the thing is with a lot of people who have disordered eating, it ebbs and flows. And so there's maybe a point in time when they are diagnosable, when they're doing the behaviors, you know, it was like whatever, 2 or 3 times a week for 2 months at a time, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you know, there's times in people's lives when they would fit those criteria and then times when they wouldn't. And so a lot of people are not diagnosed when they maybe are diagnosable at a certain point in their life. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people are just never diagnosed because they never have that quite, you know, threshold. Like they do it once a week, or they do it, you know, for short bursts, not like continuously or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But I would say that any level of, you know, restricting, binging, purging, I mean, binging is sort of a separate category because actually that's biologically beneficial for people who've been restricted, so I wouldn't demonize binging across the board. I know it's distressing as a behavior, but it's actually really a response to deprivation, and so it's your body trying to take care of you. But if you're binging, it really signals that there's an underlying restriction or deprivation going on there, maybe some history of food insecurity or something else that you need to address in your life. So, you know, any amount of binging signifies that, but any amount of restriction, any amount of purging, any amount of overexercise or medication abuse or any other ways of, you know, compensating for your food are a problem, no matter how often you do them. Mm-hmm. And so I think, especially for people in larger bodies who don't tend to get diagnosed as frequently, I say it doesn't really matter whether you have a diagnosis or not. If you are distressed and you're suffering in your relationship with food, you have a problem. Yeah. And there's evidence showing that 75% of women, but you know, women between the ages I think of 25 and 45 have some form of disordered eating or a full-blown eating disorder. It's like 10% had full-blown criteria, and that's way more than are actually diagnosed. And then an additional 65% had just, you know, subclinical disordered eating. So that's the vast majority of us, right? Yeah. You know, and we know that the rates of eating disorders are higher in the trans community. So I'd be willing to bet that the rates of just, you know, subclinical disordered eating are also higher in the trans community. And even in cisgender men, there's a lot more eating disorders happening now and disordered eating in the name of like wellness, right? Yeah. We have people doing intermittent fasting, we have people doing keto and becoming obsessed in those ways too, and doing things that are really harmful to their body. So I think everyone's at risk, honestly, and everyone, probably is already suffering from it. One thing that I sort of, my working thesis for doing my podcast in the first place was like, everybody's relationship with food is a little messed up.
Yeah.
And that's really what I found in, 200 episodes, is that not necessarily now, because a lot of people I talk to now have done their own work to recover, like I have, but like at some point, most of us go through a problematic period in our relationship with food.
That's so sad, but also makes me really happy for conversations like this and people like you that are really at the forefront of it.
Thanks.
Also, I'm curious, like, I remember I always, and I'm sure as a society, this is a general thing, and generalizing, but I feel that people just generalize that people in larger bodies are lazy, and I have so many ideas about, like, they're not productive and they're that way for a certain reason. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's total bullshit. Like, first and foremost, that's prejudice.
Yeah.
That's prejudice that comes out of diet culture, and it's really interesting. I sort of trace the history of this in my book, but we didn't think those things about people in larger bodies at all as a society really until the 1800s or so.
Yeah.
And that's when things started to shift, when diet culture as we know it today started to take root. And so, it was partly because of actually racist and sexist ideals about how bodies were supposed to look that really served the people in power, right? So, like, slavery was going strong, and there was an attempt to justify slavery by any means necessary, right? Come up with reasons why, these people over here are subhuman and we can enslave them, versus these people over here are human and we give them rights. And this idea of, like, the great chain of being sort of came out of the 1700s, where it was like a hierarchy of, with basically black people, sub-Saharan African people at the bottom, so slavery was justified. And, like, surprise, surprise, white Northern European men were at the top, and white Northern European women were a step down, and then everyone else was a step down, on the rungs of the ladder. And around the 1800s, they started to marry that idea of the great chain of being with new theories about evolution that were coming out. And, this idea of, like, people in this area of the world tend to be larger bodied, and they're more recently evolved, they're less evolved than the people in this other area of the world who are thinner. And so it really came out of these racist ideas, this racist hierarchy of bodies. That started to demonize fatness. And that's where the roots of fat phobia are. There's a really great book on this called Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Sabrina Strings. I had her on my podcast, and it was just mind-blowing. Yeah, it's fascinating.
So, and that drives people, I mean, to get things like surgery, like, what's it called? Gastric bypass. Bypass. What do you think about that?
It's really harmful. It's really
so
dangerous.
Intense.
Yeah, it's really dangerous. I mean, for anyone who's listening to this or watching this who has had it, I don't want to shame you or make anyone think that they're bad for having chosen to do this. I get the immense pressure on people to do this, and oftentimes doctors will apply that pressure in part because they make a bajillion dollars off of it. It's like tens of thousands of dollars each time they perform this surgery. So it's financially very lucrative for them. And there's the pharmaceutical industry involved as well, and the medical devices and all of it. Like, there's so much pressure on people to perform and do this surgery.
And look a certain way, and so then for their families, even from their families, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And people are told things like, this is your only chance to watch your kids grow up, and if this is a life-saving surgery. And so, of course, they're going to want to, do something to save their life and make themselves able to see their kids grow up and things like that. But I want to just say to anyone who's gone through that or anyone who's considering it, that is false rhetoric. Like, it's the supposed benefits of bariatric surgery are very trumped up, and the actual harms and potential risks of it are far greater than anyone's going to tell you. Any bariatric surgeon is going to tell you. And so what they don't tell you is that, even if you don't have the most severe complication, which is death, oftentimes people will live with terrible, debilitating stomach issues, nutrient deficiencies that can cause things like neurological malfunction, problems that last the rest of your life. You can have things like, the mildest complications are things like dumping syndrome, which is about as appealing as it sounds. It's where
you just like go to the bathroom, right?
Basically, the food just goes right through you because it doesn't really have anywhere to be digested, and so you end up with chronic diarrhea. You can end up with vomiting, and there's also a lot of like blood sugar issues that happen with that, where you can suddenly have sweating and shaking and nausea, dizziness, and you never know when it's going to strike. And this can happen to people for dozens of years out from their surgery. So it's not this is a lifelong thing. And same with the nutrient deficiencies. People have to take these intense supplements for the rest of their lives, and oftentimes are very, very expensive. Insurance doesn't always cover it. People don't always know because their doctors don't always tell them what they should be taking. And so oftentimes people end up with these really terrible nutrient deficiencies that cause a lot more harm than if, the stomach is an organ that is supposed to be there, and amputating a healthy stomach really is a terrible thing to do. And people in larger bodies can actually live really wonderful, healthy lives. They can do things that are health promoting no matter what their size is, and figure out ways to take care of themselves in any size body. And I know from someone with thin privilege, hearing that is probably like, yeah, what do you know? I know that I have that privilege, and I have dozens and dozens of colleagues in much larger bodies in my community who are doing this work, who've been doing this work for decades, and clients that I've worked with in larger bodies who've had amazing experiences of health at every size, just really learning to take care of their bodies without weight loss, without pursuing weight loss or orthorexic, dieting behaviors, that are able to accept themselves and love their bodies as they are, at least, peace with their bodies or respect their bodies if they're not able to get to body love. And so it really is possible for people of all sizes.
Wow. So as far as becoming an anti-diet registered dietitian, that's a certification that you've created and that you also train others, or?
So no, it's not a certification yet. I mean, maybe one day. With the book being called Anti-Diet, I definitely think there's probably going to be a lot of bandwagon hopping and stuff. When that comes out. But yeah, so right now, that's sort of a term that I use and a lot of people in my community use just to signify like, yeah, the word diet is in the name of my profession, and that's problematic, but I am actually not, I don't subscribe to diet culture. I'm anti-diet. I'm not going to put you on a diet. I'm not going to tell you to lose weight. I'm, on your side and fighting weight stigma. So, I train other professionals in this way of working. I train other people on, using intuitive eating in their practice, marketing themselves as intuitive eating and health at every size professionals. I also train media organizations, which is something that's really interesting because I think, a lot of media writing about this topic or covering health, covering nutrition, often do it in a really disordered way, right? And so many of them, I know from my own experience, I was a journalist with a platform covering all this stuff, struggling mightily behind the scenes and telling people very disordered things about how they should be eating. And so I think it's really important to train media and just first how to look at themselves and sort of recognize what's going on in their own relationships with food, and also what the science actually says about how people can actually pursue health at any size, that health doesn't require weight loss or cutting out all kinds of different foods. And, as journalists, we don't learn how to read research. I didn't learn how to read research until I was in graduate school for public health nutrition and dietetics, so I get how challenging it is. So that's kind of a big, part of my work and sort of piece of my heart these days is training people in the media, training other healthcare professionals as well to do less harm when they're working with people.
That's so exciting and so important, especially in today's world. So thank you for doing that. That's huge. And your book is coming out very soon. Very soon, yeah. As we're recording this, I think it'll be about 3.5 months. So very exciting. In January or? In December. So they moved it up to December 24th to have it be on shelves for like the New Year, New You displays, which is really exciting. So yeah, hopefully it'll be, people can actually even get it if they want to get a last minute Christmas gift. They can order the book and it'll arrive. It'll be there. Or if you pre-order it, hopefully it'll arrive right on the publication date. So. And what are some of the things that you cover in there? I'm assuming it's all about like empowering people to. I cover, the history of diet culture, what diet culture is, and sort of how we got here, and then how it harms you, all the ways that it steals your time, your money, your well-being, your happiness.
and then how you can take those things back, how you can reclaim your life through intuitive eating, health at every size, and just learning to accept your body, be a part of a body liberation movement, and creating a community that supports you in doing that.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.